The Meaning of the Chronogenealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 by Gerhard F. Hazel. Introduction. The genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 are unique within and outside of Scripture. They are called chronogenealogies because of the mixture of both chronological and genealogical data. It is no longer in vogue to view the chronological information in the Bible as mere window dressing. In recent decades, the accuracy of the chronological information in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, has been verified repeatedly. Internal literary data. The formula of descent goes like this. When patriarch number 1 had lived X years, he fathered patriarch number 2, and patriarch number 1 lived after he fathered patriarch number 2, Y years, and he fathered other sons and daughters, and all the days of patriarch number 1 were Z years. This interlocking nature of the information provided is forceful internal evidence that the material in Genesis 5 and 11 presents a continuous line of descent. Archaeological and historical data. Lists from different biblical manuscripts contain divergent figures. To translate AM dates, which means from creation, into BC dates, which means before the time of Jesus, we must be able to calculate the date of Abraham's birth. 1 Kings 6:1 says that Solomon's temple was begun 480 years after the Exodus. We know from history that Solomon's temple was begun around 971 or 970 BC. 480 years before that would put the Exodus at 1450 BC. We can use Exodus 12:40 to calculate the year the Israelites went down to Egypt. The problem here is that different manuscripts say different things. The Hebrew manuscript says the sons of Israel lived in Egypt 430 years. But the Greek Septuagint says the sojournings of the sons of Israel in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. It is usually calculated that half the 430 was in Egypt and half was in Canaan. Adding the 430 years from the Hebrew text to the date of the Exodus, we arrive at 1880 BC as the date when Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. Using the Septuagint figure of only 215 years, the Israelites arrived in Egypt later, in 1665 BC instead. Adding to the 1880 date from the Hebrew manuscript, Jacob's age when he entered Egypt, Isaac's age when Jacob was born, and Abram's age when Isaac was born, we get 2170 BC as the date of Abraham's birth. Adding those same figures to the 1665 BC date from the Septuagint manuscript, we arrive at 1955 BC as the date of Abraham's birth. Once we have a date for Abraham's birth, we can calculate back to the flood and the creation of Adam. If Abraham was born when Terah was 130 years old instead of 70, then 60 years needs to be added to the years before the flood. Without doubt, the figure and dates obtained from the Septuagint texts are the most attractive from the viewpoint of currently known historical data from Egypt and Mesopotamia. But the historical data from Egypt and Mesopotamia are relative. No absoluteness must be assigned to them. Caution is in order so that the biblical materials are not prematurely judged inaccurate or invalid on grounds which scholars are careful enough to regard as relative. A truly scientific approach to early world chronologies will not accord to relative chronology an absolute status which may serve as the sound basis for decisions concerning personal faith and confidence in the fidelity of the Bible. Continuing with the archaeological historical data section, the Sumerian king list is the closest parallel to Genesis 5 and 11. Several scholars have claimed that Genesis 5 and 11 are dependent on the Sumerian king list and thus cannot be regarded as a reliable index of time. The results of an investigation comparing the two lists shows that Genesis contains Semitic names, while the Sumerian king list contains non-Semitic names. The first list gives years of life, while the second gives years of reign. Genesis shows the line of descent, which is different from the succession of kings. 10 antediluvians appear on one list, with anywhere from 7 to 10 on the other. The post-diluvian numbers are even more dramatic, 9 on one list and 39 on the other. While Genesis emphasizes descent, the Sumerian king list emphasizes kingship in only one city at a time. The information in the first is well described by the word chronogenealogies, but the Sumerian king list focuses on city dynasties and rulers. The structures within the lists are not identical, and only one focuses on chronological information. The author concludes that the Sumerian king list is not a source directly or indirectly for Genesis 5 and 11. These chapters are without parallel in the ancient world. It is most precarious and methodologically unsound to interpret the biblical chronogenealogies on the basis of ancient Near Eastern materials. The proper function and meaning can be determined in their own contextual settings in Genesis 1 through 11 and the Bible as a whole. Biblical genealogical data. It is true that some biblical genealogies are discontinuous. For example, in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, it says that Joram begat Uzziah, but Old Testament references indicate that Joram actually begat Ahaziah, who begat Joash, who begat Amaziah, who begat Uzziah. It has been suggested that since other biblical genealogies contain discontinuities, the chronogenealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 do as well. It is suggested that the structure of Genesis 5 and 11, with 10 antediluvian and 10 postdiluvian patriarchs, is an intentional arrangement, similar to Matthew 1, 1-17, which has 3 sets of 14 ancestors. Just by counting the names before and after the flood, we can quickly see that one has 10 and the other has only 9. Some argue that Abram, one of Terah's 3 sons, should be counted as the 10th generation after the flood, but to be consistent, then Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons, should be counted on the other side. The figures 10 and 9, and 11 and 10 respectively, can hardly qualify as an intentional arrangement or a symmetry. The alleged symmetry of 10 generations before the flood and 10 generations after the flood is non-existent in the Hebrew text. The Greek Septuagint contains the addition of a second Canaan, making 10 generations in that translation. That this is a secondary alteration is almost certain. He is not found in the genealogy in 1 Chronicles. Kenan already occurs in the former genealogy. The figures assigned to him simply duplicate Shelah, who follows him. Some wonder if the addition of Canaan was a purposeful attempt to schematize. Comparing the genealogies in Genesis with Matthew 1, we find that no 10-10 pattern exists in Genesis that might correspond with the 14-14-14 pattern in Matthew. The formula in Genesis is much more complex than the simple patriarch number 1 begat patriarch number 2 in Matthew. Genesis contains chronological information which is not found in Matthew. The arguments against the apparent continuous line of descent in these chapters are far from compelling. The fact that some biblical genealogies have a discontinuous line of descent and in turn lack any interlocking chronological information of spans of life can hardly function as a key to determine that Genesis 5 and 11 are also discontinuous. When there is tension between secular historical time calculations and the computation of the chronological information in Genesis 5 and 11, the issue boils down to which source of data has validity and force over the other. Here the question of the authority of the biblical materials, when in conflict with historical reconstruction and/or scientific interpretations, appears in full force. Scholarly tradition argues that wherever and whenever the conclusions of historians, scientists, sociologists, etc., are in disagreement with the Bible will have to be reinterpreted to be brought into harmony with these conclusions. Another scholarly position maintains that where the Bible impinges on subjects such as history, geography, ethnology, botany, astronomy, etc., it is trustworthy. For these scholars, subordinating the Bible to modern scientific interpretations is highly problematic and reverses the structure of authority. Let's look at some non-literal interpretations of the numerical information. The Great Year is made up of 4,000 years. It begins with Adam and ends with the rededication of the temple by the Maccabees. This theory is very problematic because of numerous computational inaccuracies. Allegedly, Hebrew scribes deliberately hid all chronological information from the Old Testament in a secret system. There's a lack of evidence for this theory, and time and again the Bible demonstrates itself to be historically accurate. Instead of dismissing the figures completely, some scholars have suggested that the figures have meaning, the key of which has to be recovered. Few scholars have found this convincing. The discontinuous system claims that the list is incomplete and only contains excerpts from a longer list. This is built on historical and scientific premises, not present in Scripture itself. Among scholars who accept the numbers as historical, there are two basic interpretations. The successive method of reckoning suggests that although Adam begat an ancestor of Seth when he was 130, Seth actually arose as Scripture's next prominent figure only after Adam's full life of 930 years. A major difficulty of this method comes from the Hebrew language. The word for fathered is used in the sense of a direct physical offspring. The overlapping method of reckoning simply calculates time by adding up the number of years each patriarch lived before the birth of his first son. There are no gaps and no missing generations. Archbishop James Ussher used this method to calculate the birth of Jesus in 4 BC and the date of creation at 4004 BC. Although flaws in Ussher's calculations have been discovered, many Christians still believe that this way of reckoning is the one most consistent with the biblical text. Dates calculated using this method conflict head-on with standard interpretations of time needed for prehistoric and historical reconstructions. In Dr. Hasel's opinion, the basic issue is whether modern reconstructions of ancient history and prehistory are an authoritative norm for the interpretation or reinterpretation of the Bible. If so, the Bible has to yield when there is conflict. Ultimate authority for knowledge and faith is provided in the superior revelation of God in the Bible, and whenever biblical information impinges on matters of history, age of the earth, origins, etc., the data observed must be interpreted and reconstructed in view of this superior divine revelation, which is supremely embodied in the Bible. Conclusion. Dr. Hasel reaches the following conclusions. Time functions in a most profound way in the Bible. The genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 contribute to the progression of time in Scripture. Theologically, the succession from father to son, together with the spans of time, indicates God's blessing and grace in view of sin and death. These chronogenealogies provide the time framework and human chain that link God's people with Adam at the climax of the six-day creation event on this planet. Dr. Hasel's article may be found in the journal Origins.